scholar monk, Swami Medhananda, who is unique because of his intellectual and spiritual position in this respect, because he is a trained philosopher, trained at the University of California in Berkeley, got a PhD in German aesthetics, spent a year in Berlin at the Freie University and at the Humboldt University, where he got to the level of German where he could actually deliver his lecture in German. He was asking me whether he should deliver his lecture in German or in English. And I said that this is a rather scandalous situation, that I have to request you to deliver this lecture in English rather than in German, because it will probably get to a wider audience in this room, and me included. So he comes with a training as a philosopher who was trained at Berkeley, spent a whole year as a Fulbright PhD scholar at the Humboldt University in Berlin, and subsequently he became a monk in the Ramakrishna Order. So this is a very unusual path that he has traversed. And what is even more unusual about him is that he has two very interesting books. And what is interesting becomes interesting if it is not conventional wisdom. So he has a book on Sri Ramakrishna, which is very interesting, which is actually debated, as we were just discussing, even within the Ramakrishna mission. A lot of monks would not accept that position on Sri Ramakrishna. But today he's actually here to talk from his second book, and from the third chapter of that book on Swami Vivekananda, on Advaitic Inclusivism to Yogic Pluralism. This is an important topic because Swami Vivekananda is understood as a philosopher by many different people in many different ways. So we invite Swami Medhananda to make his powerful arguments and hopefully convince us. Thereafter, we are even more privileged that we have Professor Bergunda from the Historische Seminar, right?
Yeah, theological.
From the theological faculty, but we know him as a bridge professor of the Salveja Institute as well. So he is also in many ways a part of our institute, and he kindly accepted my invitation to participate and comment at the end of the lecture. So we are looking forward to the lecture, the comments, and then the floor will be open for discussion.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank first Professor Rahul Mukherjee for kindly inviting me, and Professor Bergunda for being a respondent today. I look forward to the discussion with all of you. Thank you all for coming. So as Professor Mukherjee mentioned, I'll be giving a presentation today on the third chapter of my latest book, which was published last year by Oxford University Press, called Swami Vivekananda's Vedāntic Cosmopolitanism. And it concerns his views on religious diversity. The vast majority of scholars throughout the world take the following view. They take Vivekananda to be a hierarchical inclusivist, somebody who holds Advaita, the philosophy of Advaita Vedanta, to be the highest. And other world religions, other spiritual philosophies are all valid paths, except they're sort of stepping stones toward the highest goal of Advaita. That seems to be the mainstream view. To give you just a few examples, Stephen Gregg has written an entire book published in 2019 on this issue, and he argues that Vivekananda was, quote, no simplistic pluralist as portrayed in hagiographical texts, nor narrow exclusivist as portrayed by some modern Hindu nationalists, but a thoughtful, complex inclusivist who upheld the superiority of a monistic Advaita Vedanta interpretation of reality. And he's not alone. There are many others who follow a similar line of interpretation. Paul Hacke, the famous German Indologist, more recently R.W. Neufeld, Wilhelm Halbfass, Ankur Barua, Raghu Ramanaju, Rigopoulos, Karl Bayer in University of Vienna, Andrew Nicholson. I'm going to challenge this mainstream inclusivist interpretation of Vivekananda. And I want to do so First of all, by insisting on bringing in some conceptual nuances into the discussion. I think a useful conceptual starting point is Alan Race's threefold typology, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. These three terms: pluralism, inclusivism, exclusivism. I find them useful, but I also find them incredibly vague and ambiguous. And in the hands of different scholars, they mean somewhat different things. And so the first step in gaining clarity on Swami Vivekananda's views is to first very clearly set out what we mean by the threefold typology. And I would argue in particular that it's extremely important from a conceptual standpoint to distinguish questions about the truth of religions, the truth claims made by different religions, from questions about the salvific efficacy of religions, how effective a religion is in leading to the highest goal of salvation. Questions about truth concern the extent to which religions provide an accurate account of reality. Questions, by contrast, about salvific efficacy concern the extent to which religions are effective in leading to salvation. Of course, the term salvation and effectiveness can be understood in different ways, but the basic position is the question is about to what extent religions have salvific efficacy. That's a separate question from the question of whether religions are true and to what extent they're true. And I think one of the fundamental ambiguities and confusions in scholarship on Vivekananda is that they mix up these two things. They're not sufficiently careful about specifying whether they're defining the terms pluralism and inclusivism in terms of truth, doctrinal truth, or in terms of salvific efficacy, or maybe some mixture of both. So I suggest that we start by very clearly distinguishing the threefold typology, the three possible positions on the two different questions. So regarding, first of all, the question of salvific efficacy, here I'm just going to stipulate the three definitions here for the purposes of today's discussion. Exclusivism about salvation, abbreviated ES, is the view that only one religion has a high degree of salvific efficacy and no other religion has any salvific efficacy at all. So salvific exclusivism. What's salvific inclusivism, IS? Multiple religions, meaning more than one, not necessarily all, but more than one religion has salvific efficacy. But one of these religions has greater salvific efficacy than all of the others. So you get this hierarchical inclusivist structure. The third position on salvation is pluralism. Salvific pluralism, PS, multiple religions have the highest degree of salvific efficacy. There are at least two, if not more, religions on a salvific par. Now, there are three positions on the very different question of religious truth claims about ultimate reality. Exclusivism about truth, and here I use the subscript U to indicate it means ultimate reality, because we have to kind of delimit which doctrines we're talking about here. I'm specifically talking about doctrines in different world religions about the nature of ultimate reality. So in that context, exclusivism about truth, subscript U, is the following. The doctrines about ultimate reality in one religion are true, while contradictory claims in other religions are false. Why do I add the word contradictory? Because, for instance, the Abrahamic religions have a lot of overlapping doctrines. They're all monotheistic religions, for instance. And so contradictory claims means any doctrine in a religion other than my own that differs or contradicts the doctrines in my own. Those are false. That's the exclusivist view. The second position on truth is inclusivism. Inclusivism about truth, subscript U, is the doctrines about ultimate reality in only one religion, let's call it R, have the most truth, but the doctrines about ultimate reality in other religions have some truth as well, though not as much truth as R. So again, you can see the inclusivist structure. Finally, pluralism about truth U, the doctrines about ultimate reality in multiple religions are equally true. And here you don't get this language of higher and lower. So now, with these two different conceptual typologies in the background, I want to give a kind of summary first of my main argument, and then we're going to go into some more details. So what I'm defending is a new diachronic interpretation of Swami Vivekananda's views on the doctrine of the harmony of religions. What I mean by diachronic is that I think his views evolved in the course of the 1890s. And I think they evolved in three main phases. In phase one, which is roughly from September 1893 to March 1894, Vivekananda defended salvific pluralism and doctrinal pluralism, so PS and PTU, as defined in the previous two slides. And he talked about what he calls the ideal of a universal religion. And I think this is very interesting. We'll get to the relevant passage. But he talks about a universal religion that we can find the seeds of in Hinduism. But he also suggests that that universal religion is not yet realized. It's not yet actualized in this world. It's an ideal. It remains an ideal. That changes in the subsequent phases. Phase 2, roughly from September 1894 to May 1895, his position becomes more inclusivistic. And I think he defends here, for this brief period of time, for about 9 or 10 months, an Advaitic salvific inclusivism, so IS, and a doctrinal inclusivism, ITU, based on the universal religion of Vedanta, which he explains in terms of the 3 stages of Dvaita, dualism, Vishtadvaita, qualified non-dualism, and Advaita, radical non-dualism. And in the second and third phase, instead of conceiving the universal religion as an ideal, as something that's not actualized, he claims that he just equates Vedanta with the universal religion. He says it's already existing. But significantly, in phase 2, he defines Vedanta as a universal religion in terms of these 3 stages. So it has this hierarchical inclusivist structure. In phase 3, he continues to equate Vedanta with the universal religion. He continues to try to harmonize the world religions on the basis of the universal religion of Vedanta, but he radically reconceives what Vedanta is. He says, so in this third phase, from late 1895 all the way up to the end of his life, up to 1901, and he passed away a year later, he defends salvific pluralism as opposed to salvific inclusivism, so PS, and doctrinal pluralism, PTU, based on the universal religion of Vedanta, but instead of defining Vedanta in terms of the 3 stages of dualism, qualified non-dualism, and Advaita, he defines them in terms of the 4 yogas. And I'm going to explain in more detail below what I mean a little bit later about what I mean by defining Vedanta in terms of the framework of the 4 yogas. But it's substantially different from the 3 stages, and it's more pluralist in orientation than inclusivist. So now let's look in a little bit more detail at these 3 phases. And then at the end of the presentation, I'm going to raise some important questions regarding his views on religious diversity. And presumably Professor Berglund might have other questions, and you might have other questions as well. There are many questions we can ask. I just want to address a few of them toward the end of my presentation. So let's start with phase 1, September 1893 to March 1894. We know that he first came to the US in 1893. He gave these very stirring lectures, speeches at the World's Parliament of Religions in Chicago. And this comes from his second piece, his second address at the World's Parliament of Religions. It was his famous paper on Hinduism, delivered on September 19th, 1893. He says the following: to the Hindu, then, the whole world of religions is only a traveling, a coming up of different men and women through various conditions and circumstances to the same goal. Every religion is only evolving a god out of the material man, and the same God is the inspirer of all of them. Why then are there so many contradictions? They are only apparent, says the Hindu. The contradictions come from the same truth adapting itself to the varying circumstances of different natures. It is the same light coming through glasses of different colors. And these little variations are necessary for purposes of adaptation. But in the heart of everything, the same truth reigns. The Lord has declared to the Hindu in his incarnation as Krishna, I am in every religion as a thread through a string of pearls. And what has been the result? I challenge the world to find throughout the whole system of Sanskrit philosophy any such expression as that the Hindu alone will be saved and not others. So this metaphor of variously colored glasses suggests, I think, PTU, pluralism about truth, the non-hierarchical view that the doctrines about ultimate reality in multiple religions are equally true, since they conceive and describe the same God in different ways. But he goes further and also defends salvific pluralism. And he derives it on the basis of doctrinal pluralism. Since different religions have the same God at their center, the same ultimate reality, the same divine reality, they're equally effective paths to the same goal of God realization. And in his first address on September 11th, 1893, he conveyed this metaphor of different paths to the same goal by appealing to verse 7 of the Shiva Mahimna Stotram. as the different streams having their sources in different places all mingle their water in the sea. So, O Lord, the different paths which men take through different tendencies, various though they appear, crooked or straight, all lead to thee. And here, in another passage from his paper on Hinduism, we get this really interesting discussion of what he calls the universal religion. So let's look at it. He says, the Hindu may have failed to carry out all his plans, but if there is ever to be a universal religion, notice the language, that means it doesn't quite exist yet. It must be one which will have no location in place or time, which will be infinite like the God it will preach, and whose sun will shine upon the followers of Krishna and of Christ, on saints and sinners alike, which will not be Brahminic or Buddhistic, Christian or Mohammedan, but the sum total of all these, and still have infinite space for development, which in its catholicity will embrace in its infinite arms and find a place for every human being, from the lowest groveling savage, not far removed from the brute, to the highest man towering by the virtues of his head and heart almost above humanity, making society stand in awe of him and doubt his human nature. It will be a religion which will have no place for persecution or intolerance in its polity, which will recognize divinity in every man and woman, and whose whole scope, whose whole force will be created in aiding humanity to realize its own true divine nature. So I take him to be suggesting here that Hinduism contains the seeds of a universal religion that does not quite exist yet. That's why he uses the future tense, it will be a religion, and so on and so forth. If there ever is to be a universal religion, Hinduism at least points in the right direction, is what he seems to be saying. Now, that was phase one, relatively short-lived. We move on to phase two, September 1894 to May 1895. This is also, I think, a short-lived period in his thinking about the harmony of religions. He now says that the universal religion actually exists now, in the here and now, in the form of Vedanta, and he defines Vedanta in terms of the three stages of dualism, qualified non-dualism, and Advaita. And since I'm doing a diachronic study, I went through the entire 9-volume complete works, which was not an easy task because it's not arranged chronologically. And so I consulted a very useful chronology compiled by two devotees in Portland who actually arranged all of the different texts and lectures we find in the complete works in chronological order. So that was very useful to me. So what I found on the basis of my diachronic research is that there are only 4 lectures and writings in which Vivekananda defends this inclusivist position. The reply to the Madras Address, which he wrote in September 1894, the lectures, The Religions of India and Soul, God, and Religion, delivered in 1894 and 1895, early 1895, and in one private letter, an unpublished letter, it was published only posthumously, to his disciple Alasinga Perumal, dated 6th May 1895. So notice that this is just a 9 to 10 month period. And I think one of the fundamental mistakes made by most scholars is that they generalize his views about the harmony of religions on the basis of this very short-lived 9 to 10 month period. And they don't recognize that there was a subsequent phase in Swami Vivekananda's thinking. And so I want to make the case that it's very important to take seriously his mature view on the harmony of religions post mid-1895. But first, quickly, what is his phase 2 view? I would characterize it as an Advaitic hierarchical inclusivism. I think you find it in its starkest form in his letter to Alasinga Perumal. He says the following: all of religion is contained in the Vedanta. That is, in the 3 stages of the Vedanta philosophy, the Dvaita, Vishishtadvaita, and Advaita. One comes after the other. These are the 3 stages of spiritual growth in man. Each one is necessary. This is the essential of religion. The Vedanta applied to the various ethnic customs and creeds of India is Hinduism. The first stage, that is Dvaita, applied to the ideas of the ethnic groups of Europe is Christianity. As applied to the Semitic groups, Mohammedanism. The Advaita, as applied in its yoga perception form, presumably he means Yogacara Buddhism, is Buddhism, etc. So I take him to be defending 2 different positions: a Hindu doctrinal inclusivism, so ITU. It's striking, the language, because he seems to be suggesting that Hinduism is the only world religion that encompasses all 3 of these stages: dualism, qualified non-dualism, and Advaita. And all the other world religions correspond to one of the stages. Christianity and Islam correspond to the dualistic phase, Yogacara Buddhism to the Advaita phase, but Hinduism alone seems to encompass all three. That's the first kind of inclusivism. It's a doctrinal inclusivism, where he privileges Hinduism above other religions from the standpoint of truth. But I think he also defends an Advaitic salvific inclusivism, as defined earlier in the presentation, that first slide. IS. Theistic religions like Christianity, so those that believe in a personal God, and Islam are placed on a lower salvific footing than Advaita Vedanta and Buddhism. Because notice the language, which I highlighted, each of these stages is necessary, he says, which means it's not enough to remain at the dualistic stage or the qualified non-dualistic stage. Ultimately, you have to come up to the Advaita stage. And because of that necessity claim, he ends up being a pretty strong salvific inclusivist, on my understanding. But fortunately, he moves away from this view, and unfortunately, most scholars, I think, have overlooked this fact. So let's look more carefully at what I take to be his mature, his final position on the harmony of religions. Late 1895 to 1901, he continues to define Vedanta as a universal religion, but he reconceives this Vedantic universal religion in terms of the four yogas. But before I get to this third phase, I want to mention one thing here, because even though I really made a point to say this in chapter 3 of my book, it's still been misunderstood. So let me try to clear some confusion here. I'm not claiming that post-May 1895, he stops teaching the three stages of Vedanta. That's not my claim. My claim is in the specific context of the harmony of religions. So when he gives lectures on the harmony of religions, for instance, when he writes about the harmony of religions, he no longer appeals to the three stages of Vedanta. But it is true that he does continue to teach the three stages in other contexts, like at Harvard University, he teaches the three stages. And I do think that there's a kind of lingering philosophical tension there. I think that he would have been better off just dropping the three stages doctrine altogether. He doesn't do so. But I think it's at least he's making a step in the right direction by dropping this language of the three stages in the context of the harmony of religions. I just wish that he were consistent about it and dropped it in other contexts as well. But he didn't. And we can talk about why, maybe. I don't know. So in any case, now let's look. Okay, and so phase 3, what text am I thinking of? I'm not going to go through all of them. If you're interested in all the references, you can look at chapter 3 of my book, but there are a bunch. It's basically every lecture he gives and every text that he writes on the harmony of religions post-mid-1895. You'll find the same doctrine explained in slightly different ways. Each one of these texts appeals to the four yogas as the main way that Vedanta as a universal religion is understood and the main way that he harmonizes the world religions. What do I mean by that? Let's begin to look at his mature doctrine. So first of all, in phase 3, in phase 1, Vivekananda, while he projected the universal religion as an ideal rather than as an actuality, so back in 1893, later in this third phase, in his lecture, The Sages of India, delivered in 1897, he explicitly declares that Vedanta is already the existing universal religion in the world. So it exists. It's not a future kind of projection. It's not an ideal. It already exists because it teaches principles and not persons. Okay. And we'll in a second, we'll see what he means in more detail, but Vedanta teaches principles and not persons. But he clarifies this idea in an interview in London held on 23rd October, 1895. He says, I propound a philosophy, meaning Vedanta, which can serve as a basis to every possible religious system in the world. And in another place, he says, Vedanta is not a religion among other religions. It's the rationale of all religions. It's the underlying philosophical basis of all religions. So from late 1895 to 1901, Swami Vivekananda held that Vedanta was the universal basis of all religions, which he consistently theorized beginning in late 1895, not in terms of the three stages of Dvaita, Vishuddhaitva, and Advaita, but in terms of the four yogas. So let's look carefully at this passage from just one text from this period. This is from his lecture, The Methods and Purpose of Religion, 14th May, 1896. He says the following. The plan of Vedanta, therefore, is, first, to lay down the principles. Then second, map out for us the goal. And third, and then to teach us the method by which to arrive at the goal, to understand and realize religion. Method means yoga. Again, these methods must be various. Seeing that we are so various in our natures, the same method can scarcely be applied to any two of us in the same manner. We have idiosyncrasies in our minds, each one of us. So the method ought to be varied. Some you will find are very emotional in their nature, some very philosophical, rational. Others cling to all sorts of ritualistic forms, want things which are concrete. So you notice that in this passage, he doesn't explicitly refer to the four yogas. I'll get to what the four yogas are, but you can already see what he's thinking of. Some people are very emotional. They would kind of take to bhakti yoga, obviously, the yoga of devotion. Some very philosophical, rational. Which yoga is he thinking of? Jnana yoga, the yoga of knowledge, right, and so on and so forth. If there were only one method to arrive at truth, it would be death for everyone else who is not similarly constituted. Therefore, the methods should be various. Vedanta understands that and wants to lay before the world different methods through which we can work. Take any path you like, follow any prophet you like, but have only that method, that yoga, which suits your own nature, so that you will be sure to progress. So on my interpretation, the Vedantic universal religion in this third period has three fundamental components. First, the principles underlying all religions. Second, the goal of all religions. And third, the various methods or yogas by which we can reach this goal. So the first thing are the principles. What's the fundamental principle? Earlier in the lecture, he explains that the, quote, the grand principle of Vedanta is, quote, that there is that one in whom this whole universe of matter and mind finds its unity, known as God or Brahman or Allah or Jehovah or any other name. So there's one ultimate divine reality, but which manifests in different forms and aspects. Second, what's the goal of Vedanta? The goal is the salvific realization, this is the term he uses very frequently, realization, spiritual experience, of the impersonal, personal, infinite God in whatever aspect or form one prefers. And he doesn't go into this language of higher and lower, saying one aspect or form of the ultimate reality is higher than the others. And third, the methods. Vedanta teaches that there are various methods for attaining this common goal of God realization. And as I mentioned already, in this passage, you don't find him specifically referring to the four yogas. In other places, he does. And I'll give you one example. This is the passage from his lecture on the ideal of karma yoga, delivered on 10th January, 1896. He says, the grandest idea in the religion of Vedanta is that we may reach the same goal by different paths, different yogas. And these paths I have generalized into four, namely those of work, meaning karma yoga, the yoga of selfless action, love, bhakti yoga, the yoga of devotion toward a personal God, psychology, by which he means Raja yoga, the yoga of concentration and meditation, and knowledge, the jnana yoga, the yoga of knowledge, intellectual reasoning. Okay. He also, in this third phase, gives an argument, a very tight argument. Whether it's convincing or not is another question, but it's a tight argument for salvific pluralism. It proceeds in two premises. It has two premises working to a conclusion. First premise: every world religion corresponds to one or more of the four yogas. Where does he say this? I'm giving you one example here. Quote: a man may be intellectual or devotional or mystic or active. The various religions represent one or the other of these types. Intellectual means jnana yoga, devotional means bhakti yoga, mystic means raja yoga, active means karma yoga. Each religion corresponds to one or more of these four yogas. That's the first premise of his argument. Second key premise: each of the four yogas has equal salvific efficacy. So this is salvific pluralism about the yogas. Okay. Where does he say this? This is one example. Quote: each one of our yogas is fitted to make man perfect, even without the help of the others, because they have all the same goal in view. The yogas of work, of wisdom, and of devotion are all capable of serving as direct and independent means for the attainment of moksha. And the second premise, I hope it signals to people who have some knowledge of traditional Vedantic schools, it should signal a radical break with the typical views in traditional Vedantic schools. Why? Because traditional Vedantins usually hold one yoga to be higher than the rest. So according to Śaṅkara's school of Advaita Vedanta, Jnana yoga is the only direct path to liberation, the yoga of knowledge. According to Bhakti schools of Vedanta, lo and behold, Bhakti yoga is the only direct path to liberation. Vivekananda is saying all four of these yogas are direct and independent paths to liberation. Did it just disappear, or are we? Oh, is that? Yeah.
But the recording is going on.
Okay. But what, did it just cut out or?
I got this.
I see. Should I pull it out and put it? Well, I think it might work now. Yes, there we go. Okay. Okay, so we got the second key premise, and this is, as I said, it's a really radical departure from traditional Vedāntic schools, which are more inclusivist in their structure. These two premises, he infers from these two premises the following conclusion: salvific pluralism. Since each yoga, each of these four yogas has equal salvific efficacy, and each of the major world religions corresponds to one or more of these four yogas, it follows, logically, that all of these religions have equal salvific efficacy, and we arrive at a robust salvific pluralism. He says this explicitly, for instance, in his 1896 lecture on Sri Ramakrishna, his guru. He explicitly affirms that each religion, quote, has the same saving power as the other. So it's a very explicit statement of salvific pluralism. But he also, in this third phase, was a doctrinal pluralist, PTU. He articulates a doctrinal pluralism in a number of passages, but I'll just give you one example. This is from his lecture, The Ideal of a Universal Religion, from 1896. He says, "We must learn that truth may be expressed in 100,000 ways, and that each of these ways is true as far as it goes. We must learn that the same thing can be viewed from 100 different standpoints, and yet be the same thing. Suppose we all go with vessels in our hands to fetch water from a lake. One has a cup, another a jar, another a bucket, and so forth. And we all fill our vessels. The water in each case naturally takes the form of the vessel carried by each of us. So it is in the case of religion. Our minds are like these vessels, and each one of us is trying to arrive at the realization of God. God is like that water filling these different vessels. And in each vessel, the vision of God comes in the form of the vessel. Yet he is one. He is God in every case." So here, he's not talking about salvation, he's talking about doctrinal truth, and he's specifically talking about truth claims in the different world religions about the nature of ultimate reality. And he's not saying that some religions have truer doctrines about ultimate reality. It's really about, very much like this metaphor of the vessels, it's really a matter of different standpoints, all of which are kind of on an equal epistemic footing. Now, a really interesting question. Why does Swami Vivekananda shift away from the second phase, Advaitic hierarchical inclusivism, to the third phase, which is salvific and doctrinal pluralism? I want to suggest an answer here. I think this passage hints at an answer. He says the following, and he's quoting that same verse 7 from Shiva Mahimna Stotra. He says, "As different rivers, taking their start from different mountains, running crooked or straight, all come and mingle their waters in the ocean, so the different sects with their different points of view at last all come unto thee." Then he says, "This is not a theory. It has to be recognized, but not in that patronizing way which we see with some people." And there's a reason why I'm highlighting this language of patronizing. Oh yes, he's now sort of imagining an inclusivist. Oh yes, there are some very good things in it. These are what we call the ethnical religions. These ethnical religions have some good in them. And then he goes on, "Some even have the most wonderfully liberal idea that other religions are all little bits of a prehistoric evolution, but, quote, ours is a fulfillment of things." And he's obviously being sarcastic when he's saying the most wonderfully liberal. It's not wonderfully liberal. Okay, one man says because his is the oldest religion, it is the best. Another makes the same claim because his is the latest. We have to recognize that each one of them has the same saving power as the other. I think this is a really telling passage. What he describes here is what he calls a patronizing inclusivist position. And I think that this serves as an implicit auto-critique of his own previous position, his phase 2 view. That's how I read it. I think I'm the first to make this argument, but I think when he's reflecting back on the second period and saying, wait a minute, I'm being patronizing here. And there's a more generous way of harmonizing the world religions. We don't need to relegate theistic religions to lower stages in this hierarchy culminating in Advaita. So between mid-1894 and mid-1895, he held a salvific inclusivist view that theistic religions like Christianity and Islam occupied the lowest stage in the Vedantic hierarchy of Dvaita, Vishtadvaita, and Advaita. And I think it's possible that one of the reasons, probably the main reason, I think, that he soon went on to abandon this Advaitic inclusivist position in favor of his mature yogic pluralist view, is that he recognized that his three stages view patronizingly relegated non-Advaitic religions to a salvifically inferior position vis-a-vis Advaita Vedanta. Now, another important point about his position is that I think he doesn't, one thing that's striking is, of course, many of you who study theology and religion will know this. Religious pluralism is quite popular now. It's actively discussed. John Hick, Paul Knitter, there are many others. But I think that something that's unique about Swami Vivekananda is that he deepens his religious pluralist position into what I call a religious cosmopolitanism. So it's logically possible for a religious pluralist to believe that there are other religions other than my own, which are as capable of taking people to salvation as mine is. But it's still possible, logically, for me to completely ignore all the other religions in the world and just stick to my own, because I know that mine is as effective as any other. What's the rationale for actually trying to learn from other religions? That's what I call religious cosmopolitanism. I think that he deepens religious pluralism into this even more radical position of religious cosmopolitanism, which means that we can and should actively learn from religions other than our own. And he tries to give a philosophical basis for this religious cosmopolitanism. And I discuss this in more detail in chapter 3 of my book, but I'm just going to briefly mention two aspects of his religious cosmopolitanism. Number one, since different religions provide different but complementary accounts of one and the same infinite divine reality, every religious practitioner can enrich and broaden her understanding of God by learning about other religions. So every single religion gives a unique take, has a unique perspective on the same infinite divine reality. And maybe my religion focuses on some form of the personal God. I can learn a tremendous amount from Buddhism, for instance, which talks about the Buddha nature, Buddha Dhatu, for instance, or Nirvana. I can learn a tremendous amount from Advaita Vedanta, which talks about Nirguna Brahman, non-dual pure consciousness. I can learn about Allah from Islam, for instance, which is the formless but personal God, for instance. So Swami Vivekananda says the following in this regard. He says, if there's anything which Sri Ramakrishna, who is his guru, has urged us to give up as carefully as lust and wealth, it is the limiting of the infinitude of God by circumscribing it within narrow bounds. So never say that God is just this and no more. We can always learn more about the infinitude of God by exposing ourselves to religions and spiritual traditions other than our own. Second, since every religion corresponds to one of the four yogas, as I mentioned earlier, and the ideal is to combine all four yogas to the best of our ability, and this is something I didn't discuss, but he says it many places. We can keep one yoga as our main one, and it's true that any yoga can take us to the highest goal directly. Still, it's better for various reasons to combine all four yogas. So if that's the case, if that's the ideal, then it behooves us to learn from many other religions, because each of the religions corresponds to a different yoga, okay? And not learning, what does learning mean? We can actually actively practice religions other than our own. That's even more radical. Where does he say this? He says the following in his lecture from 1900, The Way to the Realization of a Universal Religion. Our watchword then will be acceptance and not exclusion. I accept all religions that were in the past and worship with them all. I worship God with every one of them in whatever form they worship him. I shall go to the mosque of the Mohammedan. I shall enter the Christian's church and kneel before the crucifix. I shall enter the Buddhistic temple where I shall take refuge in Buddha and in his law. I shall go into the forest and sit down in meditation with the Hindu, who is trying to see the light which enlightens the heart of everyone. So I think what he's anticipating here is what's now being called multiple religious belonging. Paul Knitter, for instance, has written an entire book saying, without Buddha, I could not be a Christian. And this is now it's a very hot topic. Ramakrishna was probably one of the earliest examples of a radical multiple religious belonger. He actually practiced Christianity and Islam and many different traditions within Hinduism. And Vivekananda, as is one of his chief disciples, he continues to develop this idea of religious cosmopolitanism. We can actually practice religions other than our own, not just beyond even acceptance. We can actually incorporate practices and ideas from other religions into our own faith and practice. And as I said, I wanted to conclude the presentation by raising some lingering questions. There are many, and I'm just going to isolate 3, and then I invite you to ask any further questions you might have, and I'll try my best to answer them. First question. I've been talking all along about his views on the harmony of religions, but I haven't given a definition of religion. So how does Swami Vivekananda define a religion in the first place? That's the first thing. Second big question. Does Vivekananda hold that all religions have equal salvific efficacy? that they're all equally effective paths to salvation, or that some religions have greater salvific efficacy than others? Third question, how does he address the notoriously thorny problem of conflicting religious truth claims? So any religious pluralist position has to address this problem of what's called conflicting religious truth claims. I'll get to that in a second, what's meant by that. First, how does he define religion? He has a very interesting take on this. He says that every religion posits what he calls an ideal unit abstraction. IUA is the way I abbreviate it, that cannot be perceived through the senses. And you might ask, why such this abstract language? Why not say God? There's a reason. Okay, but let's see how he defines it. He says, thus, this one fact stands out from all these different religions, that there is an ideal unit abstraction, which is put before us, either in the form of a person, capital P, or an impersonal being, or a law, or a presence, or an essence. We are always struggling to raise ourselves up to that ideal. So I think it's very significant that he defines the IUA, this ideal unit abstraction, in a very expansive way. It includes the personal God of theistic religions. It includes the impersonal being of Advaita Vedanta and certain schools of Buddhism. It includes the moral law of Buddhists as represented by the Southern sect. So by that, I think he has in mind Theravada Buddhism. And he's thinking of the moral law of some modern thinkers. And because he studied Western philosophy at Scottish Church College as an undergraduate philosophy major. And so he knew that, for instance, modern Kantians held up the moral law as a kind of ideal. The ideal unity and the ideal human being of ethical humanists. There were also some ethical humanists in the 19th century that he was thinking of as well. John Stuart Mill, arguably. So he says, all religions share the belief in an ideal state, reality, or condition that is, quote, not in the senses. You don't see it actualized in this world. In that sense, an ideal. However, that ideal is understood. And so he defines it much more broadly than God, say. You can be an atheist and you can still have a religion, in Vivekananda's sense of IUA here. But he goes on to argue that every religion must not only posit an ideal unit abstraction, but also prescribe ethical and spiritual disciplines, or yogas, through the practice of which one can realize the ideal of one's religion. And he says that all ethical practices have the aim of what he calls self-abnegation. He says, ethics always says, not I, but thou. Its motto is not self, but non-self. You have to put yourself last and others before you. The senses say myself first. Ethics says I must hold myself last. Thus, all codes of ethics are based upon this renunciation. Perfect self-annihilation is the ideal of ethics. So, on my reconstruction, according to Vivekananda, a religion has to fulfill two criteria. First, it has to posit some kind of ideal beyond the senses, but that ideal need not be God. It doesn't have to be a metaphysical ultimate reality. And second, it has to prescribe ethical and spiritual disciplines that lead to the realization of this ideal. And by those two criteria, any agnostic or atheistic doctrine that meets these two criteria counts as a genuine religion. So ethical humanism, for instance, which doesn't believe in any kind of higher truth, that can also count as religion in Vivekananda's sense. On the other hand, self-styled religions that don't meet the second ethical criterion are not, in fact, religions proper. So I'm thinking, for instance, of, you might ask about religiously inspired terrorist groups like ISIS or Aum Shinrikyo would not count as religion. Why? Because of the second criterion. It runs afoul of the second ethical criterion. It prescribes unethical practices, right? So by defining religion in terms of these two broad criteria, Swami Vivekananda accommodates atheistic and agnostic religions like Jainism, Buddhism, and ethical humanism, which is atheistic, but still has ethical practices at their basis, while excluding self-styled religions that prescribe unethical practices. Second big question, do all religions have equal salvific efficacy? I think that he says no. And I think that was wise of him, because how in the world can we know that all religions have equal salvific efficacy? While Vivekananda held that more than one religion has maximal salvific efficacy, he nonetheless believed that some religions have greater salvific efficacy than others. And I don't see that as a contradiction. Remember the way that I defined salvific pluralism in the beginning, multiple religions, not all religions. That's important. More than one. Okay, what's an example? He clearly believed that Raja Yoga has greater salvific efficacy than Hatha Yoga, which is more about bodily practices. The aim of which is, quote, to make the physical body very strong. In his book Raja Yoga, he claims that the practices of Hatha Yoga, quote, are very difficult and cannot be learned in a day, and after all, do not lead to much spiritual growth. And he's really echoing his guru here. Ramakrishna also made similar statements about how Raja Yoga is spiritually a more advanced path and more efficacious than Hatha Yoga. Because the danger of Hatha Yoga is that it might reinforce body consciousness instead of helping you to transcend body consciousness. So I take it that Vivekananda's position is that at least all of the great world religions have the highest degree of salvific efficacy. Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, and that some religious paths like Hatha Yoga have less salvific efficacy than the great world religions. Now, the third question. Okay, so in the context of religious pluralism, the big question is, if multiple religions can lead to the same goal, there is this big problem that different religions sometimes make conflicting truth claims. What are some examples? Did Christ die on the cross? Christianity says yes. Islam says no. Another question, are we reborn? Have we lived before in another human body? Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism say, hold on. So, okay. Yeah, I really gotta be careful. Okay. Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism all say, yes, we are reborn. Rebirth is true. They also believe in the doctrine of karma. Orthodox Abrahamic religions say, no, rebirth is false, karma is false, at least in the Orthodox forms. How do religious pluralists handle these different conflicting truth claims in the different world religions? So, first thing I think we need to do is distinguish types of religious truth claims. This is something that John Hick does. First of all, let's talk about conflicting truth claims about the nature of ultimate reality. Okay, Muslims talk about Allah, Christianity talks about God the Father, Christ, the Holy Spirit. Hinduism talks about many different deities and Nirguna Brahman, for instance. They all seem to conflict. Vivekananda's position, in line with Ramakrishna's, is that even though they appear to conflict, they're actually complementary. The reason being that the divine reality is infinite, and that same divine reality is described in different ways from different standpoints by the different world religions. At the same time, he does acknowledge that there are other kinds of truth claims made in different world religions that don't concern ultimate reality, which definitely do conflict. As I said, did Christ die on the cross? Is rebirth true? Definitely conflicting doctrines. He doesn't deny that. But he handles them in a different way. What he says is, or his basic strategy is to subordinate religious doctrine to spiritual practice. And he says that even if a religion gets one of these doctrines wrong, even if, let's say, Orthodox Abrahamic religions are wrong in taking karma and rebirth to be untrue, that doesn't handicap these religions from the standpoint of salvation. Okay? So I'll give you one example where he says this. He says that the essence of all religions is to manifest our innate divinity through the practice of one or more of the four yogas. Quote, by work, karma yoga, or worship, bhakti yoga, or psychic control, raja yoga, or philosophy, jnana yoga. And he then adds, doctrines or dogmas or rituals or books or temples or forms are but secondary details. From the standpoint of salvific efficacy, that's the important thing here. So by privileging spiritual practice and reducing religious doctrines, not about ultimate reality, which are important, but about the other stuff, to non-essential secondary details, he prizes apart a given religion's salvific efficacy from its doctrinal truth. So even if a religion gets certain things wrong, that religion is not substantially handicapped from the standpoint of salvific efficacy, okay? So even if a particular religion teaches some false doctrines about things like rebirth or whether Christ died on the cross or not, it can still have salvific efficacy so long as it prescribes ethical and spiritual practices that have the aim of eliminating egoism. Because every genuine religious practice involves self-effacement, self-abnegation. And as long as it does that, it can bring you to the salvific goal. There's a lot more to say, but if you're interested in more details, please look at chapter 3 of my book, Swami Vivekananda's Vedāntic Cosmopolitanism, published last year by Oxford. Thank you.